Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session with my three distinguished panelists on fake news. Never mind needing an extra part from the heating, I think that there's no other topic at this conference that's going to get people's temperature rising probably more than these two words, infuriating any journalist: fake news. I think, first of all, I'd like to start by just thinking a little bit about what fake news actually is. I think it means something very different perhaps to the journalistic community it does to the US president, or indeed the people who consume news every day in all its different formats these days. So fresh off the press, while we were all sort of warming ourselves in this room, is the European Commission Vice President Timmermans has just announced that the EU is seeking feedback now due to a quote-unquote nearly overwhelming volume of misinformation and fake news that it suspects may have been used to influence elections in France, in the UK, in Germany, and also the recent upheaval in Catalonia. So they're seeking views on how to combat this in the first quarter of 2018. Of course, I think we'll still be a member then, just about. So let's hope they figure it out before we leave. So I'd just like to start off by introducing our panelists. So Will Moy, leader of the independent fact-checking company Full Fact. Keith Harrison, editor of the Express and Star, one of the most successful regional newspapers in the country. And welcome Peter Barron, who of course is our representative from Google. He's the Vice President of Communications for EMEA. And obviously we heard from his colleague Ronan Harris last night, who was very good about taking everyone's tough questions that we have with regard to Google. You're not a representative of all three tech companies, you assure me, in Silicon Valley. And I think we should applaud Google for showing up and taking everyone's questions. Originally, this panel was also going to have representatives from Facebook, would have perhaps been a little bit more balanced, but due to work pressures, just Google is the representative of the big three. So, I think it's very fair say thank you for taking our questions and spending the time here. And we can only hope that Facebook is busy working away at how to combat fake news in the meantime. So without further ado, I'd like to open what is bound to be a very heated discussion on this topic, just to ask all three of you, what is fake news and how does it impact your line of business and what you're doing every day? Where do you see it manifesting itself most? So Will, do you want to take it away?
Well, I'd love to, actually, because I'd like to start by putting it from the opposite direction. Some of you will have seen the work recently done by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. They did focus groups with the public, asking them what they understood by the term fake news. And I think that is a very important angle on this debate. Their summary includes people see the difference between fake news and news as one of degree rather than a clear distinction. Fake news is experienced as a problem driven by a combination of some news media who publish it, some politicians who contribute to it, and some platforms that help distribute it. And they say the fake news discussion plays out against a backdrop of low trust in news media, politicians, and platforms alike, a generalized skepticism towards most of the actors that dominate the contemporary information environment. Now, Full Fact, we've been going 7 years, we've been going since 2010. We exist to stop the spread of specific unsubstantiated claims in public life and to promote the availability of reliable information. You'd expect the current moral panic about fake news to be fascinating and helpful to us. And although it has brought focus on the kind of work we do, I actually see it as an absolutely malign discussion. This generalized skepticism is so very visible, particularly among the younger generation, which is most internet-centric. And I think that we will find that there is an easy and obvious and rational reaction to all the fuss about fake news, which is simply believe nothing that you see. And that is actually the worst possible reaction. So the challenge for fact-checkers in the next 10, 20 years might well be not to get people not to believe things that aren't true, but to persuade people to be willing to believe anything that they don't want to hear. And I think that's a challenge for news publishers too. It's interesting to note that part of the backdrop to the European Commission's activity, they have a big conference on in Brussels at the moment that a colleague is speaking at, is the fear of state-sponsored disinformation, particularly from Russia. And one of the stated goals of that, apparently, is to foment this skepticism. It's not actually necessary to persuade people to believe specific things that aren't true. It's enough to kick up enough dust that people give up on the premise of a shared democratic debate. And I think newspapers should be doing anything but welcoming the debate on fake news. We need to be breaking it down into distinct, meaningful problems that can be tackled and solved, and getting rid of a term that has basically started to be used just to abuse journalists.
Right, so Keith, would you like to pick up on that point as regards, running successful regional newspaper? But as we were talking about earlier, it's very hard sometimes, to get the correction out to the world in the same time frame that sometimes the inaccurate version appears, for example.
It is, and I think in the wider sense, I think Will's done a good job there of outlining what the issue of fake news is. I think one of the key things there, the key word was scepticism. And I think if we can encourage scepticism, that people will, most of these fake news stories fall apart at the first attempt at verification. I think the vast majority, not the one that Chris was mentioning earlier on, that went for years. But I think from the regional press perspective, there isn't the low trust in the local media that there may be, certainly online. I'm doing everything I can to try and help that. However, I think social media is one of the areas rather than print. Because I knew I was speaking here today, I did a little experiment yesterday whereby I put out a tweet that said that I'd been for a 10-mile walk before breakfast up in the Lake District. Anybody who knows me knows that I don't do anything before breakfast, and I certainly don't go for a 10-mile walk. And yet this tweet was liked. I know like doesn't mean that they believed it. Was liked by, and I won't name these people, another newspaper editor, a local MP, and the chief photographer who's probably put it in the UGC file and it's lined up for page 4 in tomorrow's paper. I will apologise to them and delete that after this session. But it just goes to show how these things can be taken, and the first sense of verification, if anything, rung me up and said, Keith, you went for a 10-mile walk? And of course I didn't. And I think the fakers and fake news is reliant on us not doing our jobs properly. And the way to combat them is to make sure that we do.
And Peter, you in many ways have a unique perspective into this, having spent most of your career as a journalist and now work for Google. And obviously the really key question, I think, for all of us is what specifically is, as Will said, we need to break this problem down into manageable chunks. Can you address how Google can break that down and what its role can be in addressing that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Will's point about the generalised use of the term in a very wide debate is right, that it's not particularly helpful. I think it's much better to focus on the individual cases. And I would just start by saying that Google's entire purpose throughout our history has been to take people to relevant and high quality information. So we're fully signed up in the battle against misinformation. I think it's also worth saying that this is, although fake news is a new phenomenon, the idea of deception or misinformation online has been around right from the beginning. We used to call it spam. Spam is an attempt to deceive the user or to claim to be something you're not. So we've had search quality teams working on the issue of spam for many years. Fake news is a new incarnation of that, but it is a continuation. I think it's worth just, I think, spending a little bit of time on the definition. I think DCMS's definition is as good as any that are doing the rounds. Fake news is news or information that is based on a lie with the intention of deliberately misleading people, which I think is a good place to start. Obviously, there are different incarnations of that. We saw the first, I suppose, celebrated one around the US elections, making money, which is really the Macedonian teenagers. They hadn't really any interest in Donald Trump at all. It's just they realised that people were clicking on it. So that was the money-making model. Then, of course, we have the political imperative, the state-sponsored actors, and then a much more broad use of the term would be news that people don't like, or highly partisan news, and I think we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. But in terms of how we are seeking to combat these problems, I would break it down into three broad areas. First, search quality. Secondly, choking off money. And third, promoting and working with the industry to promote high quality news. So in terms of search quality, we've done we continue to do a lot in terms of ranking changes. We make more than 1,000 ranking changes a year in terms of our algorithms. It's very much an unsolved problem. We're constantly trying to get to a better place. But of the billions of searches that we handle every day in a fraction of a second, we reckon we're doing a very good job of taking people to relevant and useful information. But of course we have seen some problems cropping up. So for example, in the course of the last year, we saw for a particular search around did the Holocaust happen, we were surfacing results that were not true and were problematic. We made ranking changes to address that problem, and it's a much better experience now. We've added a fact check label to both to Google News and to search. So where fact checking is going, whether it's Full Fact or Channel 4 News or other organisations who are routinely doing fact checking on stories, we now surface that in Google News with a little label saying fact check on it. I had a little look this morning, and a couple of stories that popped up. Spice Girls reunion is not happening. Apparently that was fake news. And Malia Obama did not get arrested in an anti-fascist attack on an old lady. So there's and you'll see those when you go to Google News. Something that we just put in place in recent days again is more labelling around the sources. So we've introduced in the States in the first place knowledge panels around the publishers of news, giving information about the kind of content that a news publisher has, awards they've won, contested stories, etc. So I think a lot of more information about the source of content is very important. On the second point, which is choking off the money supply, yes, that's very much the Macedonian case study. We put in place something called the misrepresentative ads policy. So if someone is pretending to be something else, if a Macedonian teenager is pretending to be an American news site, that is misrepresentation. So we choke off the money and disable the ability to make money from that. And I saw a piece the other day talking to 16-year-old Macedonian kids who said business has dried up. But, we used to be fake news purveyors, but that business isn't working any longer. And then thirdly, and this is really, I think, fits into the whole idea of fighting for real news, is working more broadly with the industry to surface and promote high quality news. So Google News, for example, is 80,000 verified publishers. And we're also working with a range of fact-checking organisations. We're making money available through the Digital News Initiative to new endeavours. Actually, we worked with Will's organisation around automated fact-checking, and there's a prototype in place for that. We also work with the Trust project, the Marquette University in California, which has been going on this actually before the whole issue of fake news erupted. And again, that's around creating clearer signals around news stories that are published with the aim of surfacing high quality content. So that's just a range of some of the things we're doing. I think it's worth just saying one point about what we don't and shouldn't do. Clearly, no one can prevent fake news or things that are not true being uploaded to the web. I don't think anyone would want us to be an arbiter of what is true and what is false. And we are seeing some calls for that kind of thing to happen. That would be a dangerous area, we think.
Keith, do you want to pick up a little bit on one of those points you mentioned earlier, which is, just getting in touch with Google or Facebook or Twitter to take something off that you know to be incorrect, and you mentioned that it can be quite a time-consuming process. And Peter, perhaps could you respond to that in sort of how can there be more direct links between quality journalists and Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., in terms of making sure the correct content is in front of readers' eyes and not the incorrect version, which, you know, unfortunately often is read several times more than the corrected one that follows.
I think really this comes down to what is Google, whether Google is a publisher or not. I think the case in question, without going into too many details, is that we published an inaccurate report, which was only online for a couple of hours and seen by a couple of hundred people, which then we removed fairly quickly as soon as we realised that it was wrong. Removing that from the Google search jag took days and days, Pete, as we contacted the Google, went through all the processes, and now it is subject to an IPSO investigation and, you know, potential legal action, yet the responsibility for that lies with us. Now, some people would say, well, you made the mistake, Kate, so, you know, you've got to take the responsibility for it. But actually, potentially, that was disseminated more and published on a wider basis by Google rather than by us as the content creator.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've seen many cases of this over the years where a publisher publishes something, you know, inadvertently or something that is wrong and wants it to disappear. And of course, there is a process for alerting us to that and having that part of the web recrawled.
It's slow.
It can be expedited, and actually, of course, there is the filling in the form process, but actually many publishers have come to us and said that we put up a piece inadvertently, can we get that down quickly? And we're able to expedite that process, so I'll give you my details and you can get in touch with me.
Oh, it's down now.
If others in the room find themselves in similar situations, do get in touch with me.
I mean, the case for that though is if, in its worst example, that would end up in court and me and Tony Jaffa have to stand up in court, will anybody from Google be there alongside us? I suspect not.
Well, the publisher is ultimately responsible for the material. We're obviously helping people find that material, but if something is changed, of course you can put a correction on the story, but of course you can also get it removed in due course.
So how would that be expedited now? What would you recommend to editors of newspapers and other publications trying to get those corrections out in front of people, that it's not taking days and perhaps?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's an online form, which my feeling is that it does happen reasonably swiftly. But I mean, you can certainly, particularly in an emergency, and over the years we've had a few emergencies where people have put up things which are libelous or dangerous. You can get in touch with me or my team, and we can get that done very quickly.
I wish I'd have known that 6 weeks ago.
It's a learning process.
So I'd just like to come back. I mean, obviously we just had a very interesting presentation from Oric Koppel about Wiki Tribune. And I find it rather striking that, you know, as a group of journalists, we're now sort of somewhat reliant on charitable, voluntary organisations to go out and get the story straight and in front of people, you know, and Will, this speaks to what you do, can David really fight Goliath on this front, really?
I suppose it depends what you think is the problem you're trying to solve. Full Fact, as I said, tries to stop specific inaccurate claims being made and spread and to promote good information being available. If we tried to solve the problem of people believing things that aren't true, we'd be a very different organisation that would have to work at a much larger scale. And even in the charity sector would be an interesting prospect. That coming from multinational businesses and governments would be a fairly terrifying prospect. So I'm not sure that we should imagine that people believing things that are not true as a problem to be solved in quite such a direct way. I think it is striking that Full Fact exists and that it exists as a charitable organisation funded largely by individual donors, a bit like Wiki Tribune, and by charitable trusts. We've had funding from Google, as Peter says, through the Digital News Initiative, and also with Facebook as well for our work at the election, tracking misinformation online with First Draft, the global experts who've also done that with Crosscheck in France and Valcheck in Germany. We exist in the context of a world in which there are fewer specialist journalists than there used to be a generation ago. There are fewer news outlets, actually, sadly, than there used to be a generation ago. There are journalists producing more content for more platforms in less time than ever before. And so it's actually not very surprising in a way that some of the safeguards of the journalism process have been eroded in that context. And that has partly created the space in which full fact's existence makes some kind of sense. So as a publisher ourselves, as a journalism outfit ourselves, we do something, some of which at least would have been just a routine part of newsrooms a generation ago, and is a routine part of some newsrooms in at least some contexts, but is perhaps not as well established as it used to be. We also do things that no newsroom does. So, for example, I'm very, very pleased that BBC Reality Check has got set up. Channel 4 Fact Check was actually going, their online blog, before Full Fact got going. Those are great things. Those are journalistic outfits showing their audiences that this is something we care about. Sorry, they're not more tightly integrated into the main editorial product, actually, but it's nonetheless a valuable thing. What we do that those organisations don't do, which I think is very distinctively charitable, is talk about what the evidence from thousands of fact checks tells us and what you should do as a result. So partly that's going and asking people to correct the record when necessary. We've had corrections from some of the newspapers in this room. We've had a Prime Minister stand up in the House of Commons and tell opposition MP, the previous Prime Minister David Cameron, tell an opposition MP, the honourable member should listen to Full Fact and shut up. We've had the same Prime Minister 3 months later print a correction in Hansard for something he said at Prime Minister's Questions, and that's an important additional service. But the thing beyond that is then looking at where systematically does misinformation come from and how can we intervene to make it less likely and make it less damaging. And so, for example, I've recently been at the Select Committee on Political Polling and Digital Media, at the Committee for Standards in Public Life, trying to explain empirically what we know about how this works and what can be done to fix it. And one of the, to many people, boring sides of our work is working with places like the Office for National Statistics to get official sources of information to communicate much better, which I hope you may have seen improvements in recent years, and some of them are thanks to the work Full Fact has put in, helping with government statisticians to communicate better, and I hope that that has benefited journalists in all of your organisations. So we do a very wide range of work. Some of it is absolutely classic journalism, some of it is much more like campaigning and advocacy work in a very narrow and specific field. And some of that clearly belongs in the charity sector. Some of it, I think, I would wish to see more in newsrooms like yours, and I think if we're going to earn the trust of the next generation, maybe we need to see more of it as well.
Okay, just picking up, Keith, on that point, how does a regional newspaper survive in the new world of journalism where clickbait is everything, and despite perhaps the best efforts of companies like Google to sift out fake news, how are you going to get the best stories in front of your readers and keep going when we know the ad revenue is geared towards clickbait? How are you going to address that?
I think Will makes a good point about safeguards in the newsroom, and I think the risk in the regionals is twofold. Firstly, you've got the pressure to get content online more quickly than before, so you've got reporters out in field reporting from incidents, taking information from unverified sources, which is suddenly out there and published before the news desk or anybody sensible has had a chance to look at it. So God knows what appears. The good news about that is something that can be taken down and got down quite quickly, but it still needs to be checked. And sometimes you're running live blogs and away they go. So that time pressure to get content online is an issue. I think there's also a pressure in the industry in terms of resources. And the skill set and experienced news editors out there who can smell trouble and just look at something and know that if it looks too good to be true, it probably is. And your traditional fact checkers, really, looking around the room, people should remember this, that the first fact checker should be the reporter, then it should go through the chief reporter, the news editor, subs, and in the glory days, we had a proofreader sat there checking everything was spelled right and all the rest of. And if your readers now are your fact checkers, then you're already in trouble. It's too late. And it's important. The important thing on that is it's not just to protect us from legal action, but also to protect the credibility, not just of your organisation, but also the industry in the long term. Because, as I said at the top, the regional press in particular is one of the most trusted news sources in the country. At each restructure, that eats away at our resources puts us at greater risk. I say not just as individual titles, but also in the industry itself. And I think where we're fortunate, the Express and Star, is that we've still got specialists. We still have an investigations editor, political editor, people like that, who can really drill down and get into things and understand and know who their contacts are, and be able to verify and authenticate tips and information that comes in. Because without that, if you get a call from Johnny Smith who pretends to be a local councillor and you take that as legit and you don't even bother to check out who it is, then it starts at that very first point of contact. And what we're trying to drill into reporters now is that it's more important than ever. Try and use technology to Skype people and make sure you double check with their identities, or use FaceTime, or do whatever it takes to make sure that things that when I started out and looking around the room when people started out, you'd go and see these people face to face, so you knew who they were. You'd go to the council meeting and you'd know what these people look like and who they were. And these days, actually Google makes it easier, Pete, because we can check out who they are on Google Images, etc. But there's still an important responsibility for us to do that, and it starts at the first level with the reporter.
Peter, could you pick up a little bit on the technology aspect in all of this? Because obviously a lot of the talk around, trying to influence election campaigns, looking east particularly, has been the role of the so-called bots in pumping this misinformation out in front of people at an alarming rate. And how can you talk a little bit about how Google is going to tackle that element of things, opposed to the humans as well?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's a little bit of a pity that Facebook aren't here, because I would just stress that that our model versus those of some of the other social media companies is very different. So we're not in a situation where we have micro targeting. We don't have dark posts or anything like that. So it's the point really about Google's position in all of this is that we make our mistakes in public. We're clearly working very, very hard to make sure that we're delivering relevant results. But bear in mind we're handling billions of queries. 15% of the queries that we receive every day we've never seen before. And if there's a terror incident or a shooting incident or something like that can sometimes throw up inappropriate content because we haven't seen those terms before. But what happens is that although maybe a very small number of people would make that query and receive those results, the news of the occasional mistake obviously goes around the world. So that concentrates our minds very, very strongly.
Okay, I think it might be time to open this feverish debate up to the audience, who no doubt have some tough questions for everyone on the panel. I don't know who up there has got the microphone, if everyone has questions.
Thanks. Peter, I'll throw this one your way because Facebook aren't here, but but it's the role of the algorithm over the human. We had the absurd thing about 18 months, 2 years ago from Norway, where a safeguard designed against paedophile images ended up with the famous Vietnam War girl with the napalm victim was actually removed because it was the algorithm suggested this was in fact an obscene child image photograph. This ended up involving the Norwegian Prime Minister, but it took 3 days, I think, or even 4 days before that was restored by Facebook. I'm sorry they're not here, so I'm throwing it your way as the expert who can explain that.
Yeah, well, look, it's an interesting case, and it illustrates the difficulty and the nuance in terms of taking down inappropriate content. So, for example, on YouTube, we have guidelines, and we remove content when flagged. If those guidelines are broken, of course, that covers illegal content, child sexual abuse imagery, terror content, or whatever. But it's extremely important to understand the context. And people put us under a lot of pressure to say, can't you do more to remove inappropriate content? What we do is we make sure that although we can use algorithms and machines to flag the content, that we actually have human reviewers who ultimately make the final decision. And so we've had this many times in the context of
correctly, Facebook, again it's Facebook not you, but had actually dispensed with their human checking system. I think they've now partly restored it, but at that stage I think they'd actually got rid of it.
Yeah, couldn't possibly comment about what our friends at Facebook do, but I think it's a very important point because if you think about terror, for example, you very often have documentaries about ISIS. You might have counter-speech videos, and you don't want to be in a situation where you're wrongly taking down that kind of content.
I think the other thing with Facebook is that the Facebook flag, perhaps, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, isn't it? It flags up stories that are thought to be fake news, but it doesn't specifically then point out that it lends credibility perhaps to ones that aren't flagged up simply because they haven't gone through the same algorithm. And it also doesn't remove them, it just pushes them further down the newsfeed. Unfortunately, Facebook aren't here.
It's worth saying on that particular scheme, so Facebook, as many of you will know, have a scheme where it is possible to flag a post and say, I think it's wrong, and for Facebook to refer it to third-party fact checkers. As far as I know, that's only running in the US, France and Germany, so it's not my problem, Gov. On the first question, though, I think it's really interesting to ask the question of how would that be different if it had been a junior member of staff who made the original erroneous decision rather than an algorithm? Because so much is changing at the moment, it's very hard to get a hold on what are genuinely new questions that need policy responses and need answers, and what are actually the same old questions that we've seen before that need the same old answers. In that particular case, I think it's an illustration of Facebook suffering from the fact that every decision they make about a particular piece of content is in some sense also making policy about what's okay and what's not. And at the moment, a lot of those policy decisions are being made by the big online platforms and embedded in online platforms' terms and conditions. There is a debate that has to be had about to what extent those decisions should be being made in democratically accountable places and embedded in democratic functions. For example, when it comes to the rules around advertising transparency at election time, full fact is absolutely clear, but that should be set out in law. The rules for election campaigning should be set out in law and not in online platforms' terms and conditions. In other areas, it's much harder to know. But because effectively, Facebook's decision on that image is making what amounts in practice to law for millions of billions of internet users, no wonder it's careful. You would be too in those shoes. But whether it should be stuck with that decision in quite that way, I don't have an answer to, but I think it's perhaps the question we need to be asking.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth just adding to that point, which is that, we've seen, for example, in Germany, where they've brought in a law around hate speech, which means that tech companies can be fined for not removing illegal content quickly enough. Now, on the face of that, might seem like a good idea, but the danger with that is, as Will says, that if you have tech companies, big and small, faced with the possibility of big fines, they would very quickly, I think, move to a situation where they would just remove against any flag for fear of being fined. So the free expression implications of that are quite serious.
Hi, Paul Horrocks, former SOE president. My question relates also to Google and what Ronan Harris said last night, and you just repeated it, Peter, that Google are not arbiters of truth. Now, if you're supporting the fight for real news, my question is, why not?
Well, we obviously want to take people to authoritative and relevant content. So we put a lot of effort in place to surface high-quality journalism, etc. But if you think about the trillions of separate pages that exist on the web, being updated and replenished at an extraordinary rate, hundreds of thousands of new sites being added every day. That's the web, and anyone can upload content to the web at any time of the day or night, anywhere on Earth. The idea that any tech company or any player should be charged with overseeing that vast array of material and deciding what is true and what is false, apart from anything else, it would be an extraordinarily difficult task. But I don't think anyone would want a private
but you can
company
accept that
to take on that.
There's a huge volume of
analytic.
content out there, I get that. But there are certain stories that you have got the technology to track what's trending, etc. Big stories, you know, ridiculous one, Pope backs Brexit, etc. Quickly, why are those stories, why are those sorts of headline-grabbing stories, not the local tittle-tattle that may be wrong or right, the headline-grabbing stories, once it's obvious that they're out there and they're getting the oxygen of publicity, why does Google not ask the question, is this true?
Well, actually, our algorithms do precisely that, and I mentioned the changes that we've made in algorithms aimed at surfacing high-quality content and demoting content which is bogus or of low quality. And actually, somebody mentioned at Ronan's speech last night the story relating to NASA and the signs of the zodiac, suggesting that somehow NASA had added a new sign of the zodiac. I looked that up last night, and actually at the top of the rankings are no, NASA is not changing the zodiac. So the first number of stories are all correct, and then the original Cosmopolitan story, which caused the furore, is way down the bottom. So yes, in terms of thinking about how the user interacts, searching for stories, we very much are interested in surfacing the stuff that's true and relevant. But trying to arbitrate across the entire web, that's not for us.
Picking up Keith's point, why does it take so long to check these things out? Once it's brought to your attention that something is not true, as Keith Harrison just pointed out, why does it take 3 days to get it corrected?
Well, you're talking about some different things there. What Keith was talking about was an erroneous piece, which they said we want to remove from the web. We want to remove from Google search. Actually, algorithmically, it doesn't take long at all to realize that stories are being replaced by corrections, and that rises to the top.
Can I ask a question, Pete?
Sure.
I mean, yesterday as well, Ronan Harris said that Google isn't go to an unregulated Wild West. Well, who does regulate you?
The law of the land. So whether it's copyright or libel, terror content, we are regulated by the law in the same way as any publisher is.
So do you think that the Leveson recommendation should apply to Google?
Well, then of course every conversation here is imbued with this backdrop of Leveson. But that's the point that Ronan was making last night, is that what we are doing as a search engine is so very different from what a publisher does. You curate and handle a finite number of pages every day. What we're trying to do is, in a fraction of a second, give you a relevant answer to potentially infinite number of searches every day. And we handle billions of searches every day. As I mentioned, 15% of those have never been seen before. So we're doing a very, very different task. And if you were in a situation where each video that was surfaced in YouTube, or each result that was surfaced in Google search had to be checked by a lawyer or an editor before it was surfaced, then of course you can see that the entire model of the web wouldn't function.
This platform versus publisher debate worries me a bit. I mean, speaking as a publisher for a second, if we decide that Google, Facebook, Twitter are all publishers, and we know that government is going to be doing something about Google, Facebook and Twitter, whatever it ends up being, well, if they're all in the same bracket that all the rest of us are when all that law kicks in, you never know what's going to come back and hit you in the face. I actually think these platform and publisher aren't good enough conceptual categories for what we're dealing with. We are dealing with something completely new. Government and Parliament is historically rubbish at dealing with new communication technology. I mean, this is the industry that survived the licensing of the printing press. I mean, for 400 years, Parliament has been rubbish at dealing with new communication technology. The next step needs to be clearer definitions of what we're talking about, and I think it has to be something slightly more sophisticated than are you a platform or are you a publisher? And in particular, I think Facebook and social media, you can have two people using exactly the same technological functionality for two completely different purposes in two completely different contexts. And I think that's all going to need teasing out. into much clearer definitions before we get anywhere sensible on legal responsibilities. For those of you who haven't seen it, First Draft at Harvard, who we worked with at the election, Claire Wardle's group, have just published an excellent report for the Council of Europe, which is trying to clear up some of the concepts in this debate. And although it's reasonably hard work to read, I think it moves us a lot closer to having some sensible categories to work with. And we should all be afraid of what happens if lawmakers do things with too broad categories, because we'll probably be affected too.
Well, what's the difference, Will, between the Express and Star publishing something on their Twitter feed, and which we could be sued for if it's wrong, and Joe Public publishing something? Because, you know, we've gone from essentially in the past 20 years 5,000 publishers to potentially 60 million publishers. Right. And at some point, I think Joe Public is going to lose his house. You know, the Sally Bercow case, you know, and it's going to take something like that for people to realise that this isn't. And at that point, then it's going to become, that's the only time we're going to be able to tackle this unregulated Wild West, as it were.
Well, I think those are the right kinds of questions to be asking, and I think they need to be asked from two sides, because at the moment everything I ever hear about is the problem of fake news. We're also living with the opportunity of everyone being a publisher, everyone having the opportunity to share their views and experiences and holiday pictures and everything else, and both of those need to be navigated. But at the end of the day, one lone individual can post something. Actually did during the election. One of the most important fact checks we did was by a grassroots conservative activist, a big Twitter table of, a big image table of government spending when the Conservatives arrived and when they left. It spread more than most of the official campaigning. And that was a completely ad hoc effort by one guy. So the world is changing around us, and the law is.
We've got to be quicker on our feet.
Yeah, a little bit. But we've also got to be careful, because rather like terrorism, actually the scale of a response to the issue dwarfs potentially the issue itself. And so it's possible to do more damage by responding to it than the original problem is actually causing. So again, I'm still waiting to hear people really get a sensible definition of what the problem is and what does distinguish you from Joe Public and so on and so forth.
So really, I mean, you know, from what everyone's been saying, from the questions from the floor so far, I mean, we're really, let's be honest, a long way from being able to solve these problems. And so I suppose I close out, unless there are any more questions, by asking the three of you, really, what if it doesn't go away? How are we going to, you know, what does 2018 look like? You know, we've got Brexit debate still going on. You know, the government looking incredibly fragile. We've got elections in other European countries. You know, how right now can you guarantee to the readers sort of in the middle there, who don't have a partisan view of the world, that they're going to be served well by independent and factual journalism?
Well, I think if you look at the evidence, most people have identified news publishers that they trust. Most people don't agree with all the other people about which publishers those are, and that's an issue, but most people have publishers that they do trust, that they have checked over time and sussed out for themselves. And that is, you know, the great hope that the members of the Society of Editors bring, that you can be trusted brands in the future of news. I think that if you look at how the internet works, actually being able to do corrections promptly is such a vital signal of trust that sorting out that particular scenario seems like a really valuable exemplar of a solvable problem in this space. The other thing that I think is really missing is links to sources. The fact that journalists online are not doing that at the moment is missing such an obvious opportunity to build trust with your audience. So those are, I think, simple things to remember the value of the news brand and how to reinforce that online. The thing that, were we to have an election next year, and I say on a completely non-partisan basis, I'm knackered and I really hope not. But leaving that aside, if we do have it again, the most striking thing for me is just how much news publishers are being bypassed. The political parties can go straight to their publics with no scrutiny. And that is actually by far the biggest threat. Everyone's a publisher means your prime minister, your president, your leader of the opposition is a publisher. without scrutiny, and we're only beginning to see how much we're losing.
So do you think it's incumbent on journalists to call out politicians for being liars, or to call out Donald Trump for being a liar, or is it up to Google and Facebook and Twitter to do that?
Why did you get into journalism if it wasn't to hold power to account?
But who's going to get the word out faster?
That's a great question. I'm really not sure. I mean, obviously journalists should be holding power to account. That's what it's there for. Journalism is there to have a go at people. I don't see that as Google's role. I see Google's role as sourcing reliable information for people. I see Facebook's role as helping people have trusted conversations. I would be very interested to hear your take on how far you think Google should be along that line. But I mean, I understand why Twitter haven't closed Donald Trump's Twitter account, put it that way.
I just think that I can see Ian already getting very sort of, we're up against the clock. But the only thing I would say is that do our jobs properly. If we want to be trusted media, we've got to earn that trust. And that means what differentiates us from Joe Public on Twitter is that readers have an expectation, particularly in print when they pay their 65 pence a night, that what they're reading is factual and accurate and it's gone through a verification process. So go back to what I said right at the top, is that if we do our jobs properly, we can combat fake news quite easily.
Yeah, I would just say this is an unending, ongoing battle. It's not going to be resolved neatly. But if you look at the experience with spam over the years, I think for most users, we have very satisfactorily resolved the issue of spam, making the experience a sort of deeply messy one. So all the tech companies are very, very focused in getting to a much better place on this. I think we're making progress across the board. And then the second half of the equation is what we're talking about here, which is working together in partnership with journalists, local journalists and national publishers to create a better ecosystem for news across the board.
Okay, thanks very much to everyone. Sorry for running over time slightly. And I think maybe if everyone goes off and finds a PR account for Facebook, you know what to do. Mm-hmm. Your questions can be directed there directly, perhaps en masse. But thank you very much to everyone for participating. I'm sure people have further questions, and for Peter and Keith and Will, they can go and find them at the lunchtime buffet. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Yeah, if you just sit and I'll just... Yes. Because we don't see it again, so we can't afford to pay the fees if someone scores again. Obviously we're running slightly late, so £10. Right, next session please, and then we are... Hello, you get what you need and be careful of the heaters, they're still on. It's lovely and warm here now. Thanks to you, it's lovely when I stand here.
Yeah, well I knew it's going to take a while, that's why I was so happy when you said we're going to have 15 minutes.
We did it that way.
I don't think I could have done it without...
No, it was really cold. Sitting there I'm really cold, and you were the right thing.
I had a brain freeze at home.
No, you were absolutely fine. It was really fascinating. Really fascinating. Yeah, I just loved your line when they asked about regulation, and you went, "Oh, we don't bother with that." I think you could hear everyone in the room going, "Oh, oh. Right."
I was kind of surprised at first. Surprised and not surprised.
I think that is one of the places.
Yes, yes.
So I felt like he was like proud of Wales.
Yeah.
He's very concerned about
Yeah, that's where I think
and Jimmy and I was like, oh, we're the internet guys, you know.
It was wonderful. Are you staying for lunch?
Yes.
Good.
Just grabbing it.
You grab it because just past now, but just past. So we'll be finished with 1:10. Okay. Go sit back up in the wall. You can probably get something out there if you go on up. Yes. So. Folks, can I ask you to take your seats, or we'll overrun? Right. Please don't kick the radiators. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could retake your seats, thank you. We start our final morning session before our lunch, which is being generously provided by the BBC. Please acknowledge that. But so we'll be running slightly 5 minutes afterwards, a little bit late, but over to our latest panelist. Jodie.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name's Jodie Ginsberg. I'm the Chief Executive of Index on Censorship. We publish work by censored writers and authors, and we campaign for free expression worldwide, and that includes on behalf of journalists facing censorship and who are facing threats to media freedom. Last month, on the 16th of October, a woman called Daphne Caruana Galizia got into her car, and she wasn't 5 minutes from her house when her son heard an explosion. Daphne was killed by a car bomb. She was a fearless and phenomenal journalist investigating government corruption, organised crime, and she was a very well-known reporter in her country. That country wasn't somewhere very, very far away, somewhere that we would associate with huge lawlessness or authoritarian regimes. That country was Malta. And Daphne's murder reminds us that threats to journalists are not far, far away. They are increasingly coming onto our doorstep. And Index knows this because we monitor threats to media freedom throughout Europe and neighbouring countries, and we've been doing it since 2013, and what we've noticed is a marked uptick in threats to media freedom, and that's everything from online harassment of journalists, jailing of journalists, to physical assaults. And increasingly we're seeing legislation and moves by governments that limits what journalists can and can't do. I have three fantastic panelists today who are going to talk us through those threats and perhaps with you think about what we might be able to do together to try and push back against them. So on my far right, Yavuz Beydar is an award-winning Turkish journalist. 4 years ago, he co-founded the independent media platform P24, which Index works with, to monitor the media sector of Turkey. It also organises surveys and training workshops. He's also the editor of just-launched news site Aval, which aims to become the hub of in-depth reporting and news analysis and diverse opinion about Turkey in English, Arabic and Turkish. Richard Gisbert created the listening post for Al Jazeera and hosted the programme since its debut in 2006. Before that, he spent 11 years as a London correspondent for ABC News, doing extensive war reporting in the former Yugoslavia, Chechnya, Rwanda and Somalia. He also told me earlier he's normally in my seat chairing, so there's no pressure. I think he might be marking me out of 10. Tim McGowan is a writer and freelance journalist whose work has been published in Al Jazeera, The Washington Post and Reuters, and an extract of his forthcoming first novel, Call Him Mine, appeared in the autumn issue of the very excellent publication Index on Censorship magazine, which you can get a free copy of, if you're lucky, in the breakout room later on. So, Yavuz, I want to start with you. We know, I hope all of you here at least know, of Turkey, unfortunately now, as the country that's the biggest jailer of journalists worldwide. That's what's in the headlines. You've had personal experience of operating in Turkey as a journalist, and unfortunately now as a journalist in exile. Can you talk us through briefly what it is actually like being a journalist in Turkey, trying to report the news independently?
Well, I'm one of those lucky ones. We are about 50, give or take, outside now. Some in Canada, some in North America, in the United States, some in Europe, and some in Africa, a couple of them. difficulties, if you mean domestically at home in Turkey, of course, it's huge. Situation is basically dreadful, appalling, because we are victims of an irrational, acrimonious force that is barbaric in its ways to criminalize journalism. Whatever you do, if it is critical, you face jail, you face at least court cases and nightmares. So self-censorship has been vast. Now it's about 90% of the Turkish media sector is more or less directly or indirectly under the control of the government or personally by Mr. Erdogan. And jails are, cumulatively more than half of jail journalists in Turkey, in the world, are in Turkey. Abroad, there are difficulties on several levels. First is, of course, my colleagues in Germany, particularly persons like Can Dündar, lives in Berlin, where 80%, 90% of taxi drivers are Turks. And 80 or 90% of them are pro-Erdogan. So you can imagine how difficult it is to move around without being harassed verbally or physically in those environments. I'm lucky because I live in Southern Europe, away from that kind of threats. Second level is, of course, as we saw in some cases in Spain, the abuse of the Interpol system that led to the jailing of two activists, one Kurdish and one leftist activist, and they could get out after 2 months of imprisonment in Barcelona and Madrid. And that is a continuing pattern. I had to cancel one conference in India, advised by some people. So we have to move very carefully, so even in Europe, in the European Union sphere.
So is it the case that as a Turkish journalist, anything you report that isn't the government line is considered effectively criticism of the government and could land you in jail?
It's completely arbitrary. You never know what you face when you tweet one single line or if you write an article. It is a sort of a poisonous mukhabarat kind of system now operating, like the ones we saw in Syria or in Azerbaijan, that somebody whispers to somebody who whispers to somebody, and that goes up to the upper echelons on the political sphere, and you suddenly hear the knocks on the door. It is a nightmare situation in a country still negotiating membership with the European Union. It has failed for about 2 years now to meet the Copenhagen criteria, and it is just a show that its negotiations are pretended to be continuing, where European leaderships are pretending that Turkey is still qualifying for negotiations. It's a very bizarre situation in terms of observing the relationships.
And there's some cases like the Altan brothers we might come back to that might be sort of turning points one way or the other. We might come back to them, and interesting, I think, segue as well on fake news piece today in the Washington Post that I would recommend to everyone. But I want to ask Tim, we talk about in superlatives often as journalists. We talk about Turkey as the highest jailer of journalists in the world. Unfortunately, Mexico now is becoming increasingly one of the most dangerous places for journalists to operate. I think more than 10 journalists killed already.
Well, it's either 10 or 15, 17, depending on which source you consult, and it's incredibly difficult to get clarity on how many journalists have been killed because of their work. Because the greatest fiction writers in Mexico are the police. For example, the murder of a Jalapan journalist in 2012, Regina Martinez. I have notes in front of me because I want to make sure that these underknown cases do get out. She was killed in 2012. She was a highly critical journalist working against the Veracruzano state. And she was murdered in April 2012. Police found a small quantity of beer bottles. We're not talking about George Best levels or anything. And concocted a nonsense that she had been murdered not because of her criticism of the government, but because of a crime of passion by some speculative, invented lover. The second thing they did was they dumped an enormous quantity of fingerprint dust all over the scene to such a degree that genetic material was lost. And so her case is enormously high profile. The CPJ has all but confirmed that she was murdered because of her work, but the fact is that investigation does not meet standards of due diligence in Mexico, and so the problem is probably the tip of the iceberg in terms of figures. Like CPJ says 30 have been killed because of their work. Article 19 says 111. But I did a troll of local media outlets and found that the figure of journalists killed since the launch of the drug war on December 11, 2006 is probably closer to 175. And it's not just journalists who are being murdered, it's there's fixers, stringers, producers, cameramen.
And who by? By the government, by security forces? What is the source of this activity? I know impunity is a major problem.
Right, yeah, because if a crime is committed against you, you have a 1 in 100 chance of that crime ending in the conviction of the person who assaulted you. And that figure drops for journalists. 2 out of 800 assaults on journalists reported to a dedicated government body on the matter. 2 out of 800 have been solved. But the source of the threats, I think we have to sort of move away from the kind of DEA map of cartel control of Mexico. You can talk about Sinaloa under Chapo, you can talk about Veracruz under the Zetas. That's a general picture. What actually happens is that there's a nexus of a sort of a deep state nexus, really, of mafia, local government, and organised crime. And in a struggling economy where the only thing doing well is the black economy, organised crime is going to wield quite a bit of financial clout. And so you will find in a place like Coahuila, it's a report that came out on Saturday in The Guardian from David Agrin. 3 of the last governors of Coahuila between 2006 and 2014 had their election campaigns funded directly by the Zetas. So, I mean, it's a mixture. It's from police. I had a friend of mine who had a gun pressed to his head by members of the Juarense Federal Police in 2011. I have another friend who lives in fear of the Zetas in Costa Rica. And I have another friend who won't use Uber because she's afraid that the mayor of Mexico City is monitoring her movements. So it could be one of 3, you know. And
listening to both Yavuz and Tim, it's astonishing at all that journalists even choose to operate in those environments. And maybe that's something that we can come back to. We talked a little bit, Yavuz mentioned a little bit about self-censorship. But I want to bring in Richard. And Richard, Al Jazeera has been subject to something quite different as a media organisation, but I think one that is part of a greater trend. There's obviously been the shutting down by Saudi Arabia and Jordan of the Al Jazeera bureaus. Israel's moved to do the same thing. Egypt had done it before. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that experience.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say I'm here speaking as an Al Jazeera employee as opposed to on behalf of the channel and covering these media issues as well. And I've been covering stories at a safe and cowardly distance in Turkey, where Yavuz has been, and we've done Mexico as well. I think the Jazeera story really reflects a larger trend. You know, if you spool back to when Jazeera was launched in 1996 in Arabic initially, that set off a journalistic revolution in the Arab world. You've all heard the story: 400 million people getting the kinds of journalism that they had never seen before on their mainly state-owned channels, showing potentates cutting ribbons, having photo ops, and being enlarged by media. Jazeera comes in, rocks everybody's world. They don't know how to deal with it. The initial thrust is to throw Jazeera reporters out of this country and that country. Interesting thing is that the only country in the Middle East, well, one of the few countries in the Middle East that hasn't done that is Israel. Now Netanyahu's talking about it, but there's a parliamentary process that he'd have to go through. And then phase 2 of that was what I like to call it the if you can't beat them, join them phase, where the Saudis, who were among our worst critics at the outset, started to invest in media of their own, launching Al Arabiya, another news channel that was pan-Arab. And they went through that phase for a while. Then there were other convulsions along the way relating to, you know, the Americans and the Iraq War Coalition. George Bush, according to Downing Street, at one time suggested bombing Al Jazeera's headquarters in Doha. The British had to talk him down, had to remind him that the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar has 9,000 American boys and girls in uniform, and they conduct many a military operation from there. Even Bush saw the sense in that. And so he backed off. Then things trundled along. Arab Spring occurred, seismic changes in relation, also powered by social media, Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere. And then we come to 2017, where, as you see elsewhere around the world, in Russia, in the Philippines, in the US, just about everywhere, a greater intolerance of journalism and more scope for leaders to do things anti-journalistic than would have been acceptable 5 or 10 years before. So the same kind of anti-Jazeera movement comes out of the Gulf. The Saudis are behind it, the UAE, the Egyptians, who of course don't like us, and backed by Trump. And then Trump, and you have a new prince in Saudi Arabia who's pushing all the wrong buttons as far as we're concerned. And then that same discussion comes up that Bush had with Blair back in 2003, 2004. What do we do about Al Jazeera? And who would have thought that Donald Trump would make George W. Bush look like a nuanced thinker? But he's managed to do that, and so here we are. And again, Jody, I just see this as being, you can take Jazeera and use it almost as a barometer of social, political approaches to journalism around the world, and it goes up and it goes down depending on who's in power and which way the wind is blowing.
And I want to pick up that Trump mention and actually spin it to the other ways. I wonder whether you feel, or whether you've noticed, that very public dissing of the media that we're seeing by Trump. What impact has that had, if any, on countries like Turkey and the ability of, say, Erdogan to get away with even more? Is that being used? We see it being used as a justification for shutting down media in places like Cambodia. I wonder if that's something that is encouraging the likes of Erdogan in Turkey.
Of course it does. I mean, but what surprises me is that the public mistrust of the Turkish media was far more. It started in the 90s in a very deep scale, continued until deepening sense until today. And the phenomenon fake news, in a way, surprises me because, basically I think the Turkish media was the innovator of that years and years ago. I was working as a news ombudsman between 1999 and 2004, and I ended up being, landing in the Guinness World Record book of being fired as news ombudsman because I exposed the fake news. Implanted by the military, who was very powerful then. So back to that, I think the issue is the public mistrust has been there. I think the new phenomenon that you mentioned has been utterly emboldening the powers that be in Turkey, and it gives them, I think, free rein, and it raises their arrogance to a new levels, because there's no more any kind of security valve for the journalists in Turkey, or particularly in those countries that are members of the European Council of Europe. In the system of European Court of Human Rights was, until maybe 4 years ago, was important because countries paid attention to the rulings. No more. There is no more any kind of instance or institution that we can turn to. Basically, the powers don't care anymore. They don't give a heck.
And they used to pretend, that we knew that they didn't care before, but at least there was the pretense of that.
Yes.
And on human rights, on the rights of journalism, that's one of the things that's most notable for me, is the pretense has gone away. They're not even pretending anymore, and too often they're getting away with it.
It came to such a way that openly, publicly, Erdogan, emboldened as he is, said, how much do we have to pay? How much do they cost? If the court of Strasbourg says, okay, you pay for Richard Gisbert, you held him in prison for 1 year, 50,000 or 5 million euros. Who cares?
And I think your point about public antipathy is interesting. One of the things we've noticed through the Mapping Media Freedom project is that's often a precursor, I think, to greater crackdown. So we noticed already, one of the things that we noticed in Turkey was that sort of online harassment of journalists, local government officials publicly denouncing journalists as sort of a precursor to a much more public move by governments. We've seen it in Poland and we've seen it in Hungary. I wanted to, and I'm sure we'll come back to that because it feeds into the questions that were being asked earlier around fake news and trust in journalists, and I'm sure this august body can start to think of ways that we can start to counter that. Before I open it to questions though, I wanted to come to Tim because you talked interestingly about your friend that doesn't get in an Uber. And surveillance has been had a major impact, I think, on the way in which journalists can and can't operate in recent years. And I wonder what impact surveillance has had on the ability of journalists to report in Mexico.
Well, I mean, the major scandal in recent times was the revelation that the Mexican government had been using anti-terrorism hardware and monitoring surveillance equipment bought from the Israeli government ostensibly to monitor the cartels and kingpins and so on, but it was being used to track human rights defenders, indigenous rights activists and reporters. And you know, that's you know, obviously that's one kind of surveillance. The other kind of surveillance, I suppose, is the fact that you know, you go to a place and you know, that you're quickly picked out as not from there and asking awkward questions to a point where we went to one local newspaper in Costa Rica, it's an oil producing city in Veracruz, to a newspaper which I won't name, which is commonly considered a cartel newspaper. And it was being guarded not just by armed police, but by you know young fellas about 16, 17 with kangaroo pouches that had like smartphones and a pistol in them. I went upstairs and presumed that this was just part of the town's vibe or whatever, and began talking to a chap who works there, and he said to us, please, like, for God's sake, like, journalist to journalist, just don't ask these questions, get the hell out, because like I can't, if I say anything to you, I'll be gone, like, you know. He's still around, but you know.
Okay, let's talk.
Yeah.
Richard, you've been hosting the Listening Post since 2006. I wonder if that time, whether you have noticed the increased use of surveillance by governments and others having an impact on the way in which journalists operate or their ability to operate, or whether you see the limitations on media freedom coming largely from elsewhere.
You know, surveillance, it becomes more and more thorough every day. There are new systems to do it, but I think, you know, one of the things, the ways in which journalists have fought back over the years, not enough of them, but I think it's real, is you know, the use of encryption. I mean, think about it. I mean, 10 years ago, had Tim and I been in contact, had I been a source and he been the journalist, would encryption have even come up in our communications? We wouldn't have gone there. And I find that the whole surveillance encryption debate is one that journalists were very slow to learn on. They were bad at protecting their sources. They were bad at protecting themselves. And governments were bad at understanding what it was. I mean, it wasn't just Theresa May who just suggested that we end encryption. It was David Cameron before her. So I mean, I find surveillance, it isn't my specialty. What I do notice is journalists were slow to learn about it. Governments have been worse at dealing with it, but we are considerably, exponentially better than we were, say, 10 years ago.
One important challenge that I see after having launched Ahval 1st of November is an aspect that we hadn't given so much thought about, which is to use pseudonyms of the opinion columnists or reporters operating in Turkey. You know, I have a pretty large network of academicians, experts, etc., and most of them approached say I want to write, I care as an intellectual about this country, but I can only write under a pseudonym. The same thing with the reporters, and that causes us a lot of problems in terms of credibility, in terms of perception of you know, trustworthy website or trustworthy the news source. That's a big challenge now. I think more or less 40% of whoever we approached are suggesting Yes, but under those conditions.
Just one thing I want to mention on Turkey, and we discussed it earlier. You know, we've been covering the Turkey story since 2006. Yavuz has lived it. But one of the things that we noticed was journalists not supporting other news organizations early in the Erdogan story has proven to be critically important. Yavuz will correct me on the dates, but I think it was around 2008, 2009, when Doğan Yayın, which was the biggest news conglomerate in Turkey, owned a bigger piece of the Turkish media sphere than Murdoch owns of the British media sphere. They actually got into problems with the Erdogan government over a property development in Istanbul. They fell out not initially, not over their journalism, but on some side business that the conglomerate was doing in another area. All of a sudden, Erdogan turns against them, and presto, a $1 billion fine for back taxes, which I thought was very convenient and quite colonial because it was a nice big round Western number that everybody could understand. And Doğan is then forced to parcel off a lot of its news assets and is effectively knocked out of business. But other Turkish media, many of the other Turkish media outlets at the time, needed to stand up at that moment and protect people that they are in competition with every day. And they failed to do that, including all the media outlets owned by the Gülenists. Zaman, the biggest English language newspaper in the country, was among the papers that was taken down after the failed coup of 2015. Of 2014?
14.
And we sat down with an editor from Zaman, and he was, making all the kinds of statements that you would expect of an editor of a news organization that was under siege. And the question we had for him was, where were you in 2008, 2009, when Doğan Yayın went down? That's when you needed to step up. But at the time, your patron was supporting this government. You also had commercial reasons to see the end of a competitor. You saw a bigger market share. And why should other people stand up and fight for you today when you failed to stand up for your colleagues 5 or 7 years ago? And he did not have a good answer for us.
And
it tells this is like a end result of a rotten media sector that began in the early 1990s. The other media proprietors could not stand for Doğan because they were as rotten as the other.
And they had commercial reasons.
Their rivals.
So I want to get solidarity. I'm sure is something that all of the British newspapers amongst you will feel very strongly for one another. And I am keen to get you to speak. I think we've got about 10 minutes. So if you have questions, please raise your hand. I'd ask you to say who you are, please. There's a question here.
Paul Connew, media commentator and a columnist for the New European. With regard to Turkey, how concerned are you that the Mueller inquiry in the States now is targeting General Flynn, currently more on him allegedly receiving over $1 million or more with his son for trying to help extradite the exiled Turkish cleric who Erdogan claims was behind the coup, which is interesting because Flynn is obviously under investigation with Russian connections too. But it's interesting that the Turkish one seems to be the one that's more likely to lead to, in the short term, to an indictment.
I'm not concerned, but I'm very excited about this story. It's the most exciting story, journalistically speaking. It has very many layers, but short answer is that it's not going to evaporate. It's going to be more and more deep, and it may lead to an impeachment even. It will be a very strong element in the impeachment of Trump, because there is very concrete evidence, it seems, there, at least suspicion of such. And another level is not extradition of Gülen, but the trial of this Iranian-Turkish gold trader in the Southern District of the New York Federal Court.
I mean, in Flynn's case, it seems almost certain that he failed under the Foreign Agents Registration Act in the States. Anyway.
Right. Yes. We'll have to see how this story develops. But there is, as I said, we are following that story, and it is forking into this trial of the federal court, because it's as implied by NBC News, also not only the kidnapping of Gülen and taking him to Turkey, but also taking this Iranian gold trader, which is a nightmare for Erdogan, because we are talking about a vast organized crime story. It involves even that, so it is big story. Yeah.
Do we have other questions in the room? Goodness me. Yes. Yeah.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much to the panel. It's frightening to be safely protected here in Britain, and then to hear what is going on and be reminded of what's going on elsewhere. And on that subject, can I ask the panel what they think the effect of what goes on here in Britain, how free the media is here, and how much government attempts to shackle us here, is seen elsewhere to those who would attempt to control and close down the press in other countries, and what more do you think that we can do in this country to fight on your behalf?
I don't think journalists overseas pay a great deal of attention to what's happening within the British media sector. I think when they look at the British media sector, the discriminating ones, they'll see a country that has a completely different set of media problems. This isn't on the agenda, but the country is currently dealing with the ramifications of Brexit, a 52-48 vote that resulted after 70% of the newspaper market, which is in the hands of right-wingers, advocated a certain position. I think the discriminating viewers of British media will see also the huge effect that those newspapers have on broadcast output, which is regulated. That's been studied by Cardiff University and others and shown to be significant. I think when they look at this country, they will have seen that last week, as her government was disintegrating around her, Theresa May losing a minister one day, preparing for the collapse of negotiations with Brussels on another day, somehow found the time to attend Paul Dacre's 25th anniversary, because she knows who runs the country. I don't think Britain, through its robust attempts to protect the freedoms of its journalists, I don't think it sets an example that other countries follow. I think the model here is deeply, deeply flawed. I think that anybody with a discriminating point of view, looking at the way the media are tilted, looking at the 52-48, anyone who would think that the media haven't actually been dictating a policy that is probably not in the long-term interests of the electorate, I don't think people see Britain as any kind of shining example for media.
And we know certainly at Index, though, that what the government says or what the government does is picked up elsewhere. So you can bet every single time a British government official says something that might suggest that they want to more closely or tightly regulate the media, or anything that might limit free expression in Britain, I will get a phone call from RT or Sputnik, because they are desperate to get me to say something that will validate the Russian position on limiting free expression, using the UK as a shining example of a narrowing of free expression.
And the Snoopers charters will have helped that taste.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to...
I think the closeness of media to government in Britain is it's more subtle, but it's not completely different to the way it operates in Mexico. If you look at Peña Nieto's current administration, they're 60 billion Mexican pesos over budget in terms of PR and advertising. You have papers like Excelsior and La Prensa, which as attack dogs of the Mexican left, kind of make like Chris Evans look a bit mild. Then at the same time you have this like determination to smother dissent by cutting independent media out of the picture. Like in 2011, Diario de Juarez was stopped from attending police pressers during the height of the drug war. because they'd been perceived as being too harsh. Contralinea covered a bunch of stories about Pemex, and Pemex withdrew its advertising and nearly crippled the paper. Processo criticised the federal government. The federal government pulled out their advertising. So the only thing that can thrive in these contexts is propaganda and government PR. So while it's like blatant and obvious to the point where there's like a Mexican slang word for a paid journalist on the government payroll, a chayotero, I guess look at Mexico as like the kind of the canary in the mine shaft or something for Britain. Like, you know, not saying like be thankful for what you've got here, but like I wouldn't be so concerned about looking for Russian conspiracies and magic, you know, troll bots from Macedonia when, like you say, you know, the guys are able to make time for each other's parties, even at times of crisis, you know. So I think a bit more alertness.
The sub-editor in me noticed that on your little quick, what were they called? Quick program, that this session was called, I think, Media Freedom Under Treat. So I'm going to ask for a kind of treat view from our panelists. What could we, as journalists in the UK, do to better support media freedom in the countries in which you operate, or generally? What could the individuals here and the organisations that they represent do to better ensure that media freedom is not just protected in the UK but internationally? We'll start with you, Tim.
Just read about the situation as much as you can, you know. I think also, if possible, like try to foster links with local journalists. Local journalists in Mexico are like foundational to the ecosystem of coverage of that country. You go in as a foreign correspondent, you are just like Google Earth, but they're like the actual details. And if they're getting harassed or assaulted or killed, you have silent zones opening up all over the nation, and it makes it impossible for even general foreign coverage to get out. So I don't know, like I would love to see some sort of international solidarity campaign between UK local journalists who are doing the real work here, supporting Mexican journalists who are doing an analogous thing in different but you know, equally vital circumstances.
Thank you.
This will sound a little woolly and a little bit granola, but there are more than 100 NGOs working around the world pushing on these issues. Organizations like your own, Article 19, CPJ, RSF, IFJ, their organizations, Rockstar Journalists in Turkey, all these countries. Cut them a check, send them a monthly donation. And it doesn't sound like much, but it's all that they have. And until bigger, better institutions are formed, and I, for one, think the UN needs to have a special agency on media, because every major institution in the world the UN looks at, and they leave media alone. They give it a small office in UNESCO. It's ridiculous. Up until that happens, I send money to people who are doing good work to protect people in lands far away.
You know, I would raise the alarm to much higher levels. What I have seen since I left Turkey, 36 hours after the coup, I've been facing these questions, and as I followed and map our colleagues inside and outside Turkey, situation is more than desperate, actually. It is breaking the patterns. I would second Tim about being, caring about whatever happens in places like Turkey, etc. Caring, in a sense, means today that if you don't, this wave is going to continue to creep into all these democratic societies where the media are operating. You have to care beyond the borders, but in a sense that goes beyond the usual stereotypical, I would say, solidarity acts, because they don't function anymore. You know, I just observed Reporters Without Borders, CPJ, Human Rights Watch, all of these institutions fighting desperately to get these journalists out of Turkish jails, for example, or Azerbaijani jails, but we are talking about Turkey negotiating partner with the EU. Not even there it's functioning anymore. So this kind of actions don't bring any results anymore. Forget about that. What means is, I think, as long as these are continuing, to bring it into a new level, meaning either, for example, Society of the Editors here can perhaps work for adoption of each and every journalist by a single newspaper in the UK. Let's say newspaper X adopts journalist Y from a prison and follows his or her case on daily basis. This is our journalist. This is our honorary member of staff. We care about this person. And report what happens to his family, financial situations, sisters, brothers, daughters, kids, etc. This will bring the civil society to a higher level of awareness wherever they are. In a small, even small towns in the UK are important. I think that's the way it should work now. More active, adoption process, but not CPJ adopting. They don't care anymore. But if civil society becomes more vocal, you make a statement to this regime.
Put a face to the situation.
And also bring action to a new level. It may perhaps lead to town X in UK, Spain, Germany adopting, each and every town, municipality adopting a certain dissident, not only journalist, as part of their honorary citizenship. I think we have to go to that direction now, because the situation is truly, believe me, desperate.
I think that is a fantastic both provocation and an invitation to everyone in the room for a way that they can concretely link to an individual who is facing very serious and direct threats to their own personal freedom, not just media freedom in the country in which they face. And it would be great to see perhaps next year at Society of Editors conference that a majority of Society of Editors members had taken that up. In addition, of course, I didn't pay him in advance, but Richard's right, organisations like Index rely on individuals like you to support us so that we can continue to document the threats against journalists and campaign on their behalf. So it would be fantastic if you've enjoyed the magazine today or you've been inspired, please go on our website and see the ways in which you can support us. Thank you very much to the Society of Editors for inviting all of our panelists. Please congratulate them. And you are invited to lunch now, kindly provided by the BBC.